Welcome everyone to this Q&A for the US Grand Prix. What a race it was, a dramatic race, and a race that really, the thunder for Ferrari has been stolen. What a great weekend it was from them in the sprint, and of course securing a 1-2 in the race. But I predicted, actually, I did get the order the wrong way round. I thought Sainz might win it because he was very strong in the sprint race, a former pole sitter here as well. But what a drive it was from Charles Leclerc, leading from the first corner after Max and Lando were more focused on themselves. And he just had tremendous pace. But I don't think anyone really expected from Ferrari. And yeah, looking at the lap times, he was just solely in control of that race, and that was a 10 out of 10 performance. While he didn't overtake anyone else out on circuit, the fact that his pace was so good as it was, and he managed his tyres and managed that race in that manner, is just yeah, very typical of Charles Leclerc. And Carlos Sainz's pace was very good as well. Of course, wasn't as fortunate to make up 3 positions at the start of the race, but still ended up doing a great undercut on Max and had good pace in his team on his teammate at the end as well. So very, very good showing from Ferrari. But of course, it's been all completely overshadowed by Max and Lando's battle. What a battle it was, but of course it ended in a very contentious issue down to the stewards, which of course has got a lot of people up in arms, myself included. Have never been a fan of these racing rules in their current guise, and we saw that come to fruition yesterday. But we've got lots of questions to get through, so let's start with Max and Lando, shall we? And then we'll get on to the rest of the race afterwards. So my first question comes from RC Bash Crew 28, who asks, why didn't Verstappen get a penalty for pushing Lando off the track when George did? It was the same corner also. Very good question, and well, the short answer is George got a penalty because he wasn't ahead at the apex. So the whole racing rule now is that if you're ahead at the apex, you are entitled to racing room if you're on the outside. If you're not, and you're the inside driver and you're ahead at the apex, you are able to basically just run the outside / overtaking car or out of room. So it's not a racing rule I like, because it puts a lot of onus on it basically makes overtaking on the outside nigh on impossible now, is what we've seen from this weekend, because it just means that it doesn't matter how quickly you go through the inside line. If you're ahead at the apex, that is all that matters. It doesn't matter, as we saw from Max Verstappen running off track, that as long as you're ahead at the apex, you can still run off circuit yourself, force the other driver off track, and with no intention of keeping it within track limits, and you can maintain that position, and it's your corner. Now with George Russell, and I think Oscar Piastri also got a penalty as well, although I don't know if Oscar Piastri, this was in the sprint race on Pierre Gasly, I can't remember, I haven't seen it, if he is ahead at the apex while overtaking Pierre Gasly. I'm going to assume he wasn't, or deemed to not have been ahead at the apex. That he also technically ran Gasly out of racing room, and so did George Russell. Because they weren't ahead at the apex on the inside, they had to leave racing room. They didn't, and that's why they got 5-second time penalties. However, with Max Verstappen, the reason why, and I don't actually know why he didn't get a penalty, to be honest with you, because in my personal opinion, the rules haven't been applied correctly. Because, as I just mentioned, technically speaking, the inside line, as long as you're ahead at the apex, that's all that matters. But there is a rule. There is a rule, and it's I'm going to paraphrase here, and it will be on screen right now, in the racing guidelines that were issued in 2022, of course, in response to 2021, and we all know how kind of that went down. Most notably, I think people's minds will think to Brazil 2021. That's the extreme scenario here of kind of the head at the apex. But ultimately, this clarification, or this guideline of the racing rules, states that you still have to keep your car within track limits when being ahead at the apex, when you're the defending car. That's paraphrased there. As I said, the exact wording is on your screen right now. And that's exactly what Max Verstappen didn't do. He let off the brake because in the initial braking phase, Lando Norris was ahead. Now, if Max Verstappen doesn't let off the brake and allow his car to roll through the corner with extra speed, Lando would be ahead at the apex and he'd be entitled to that racing room, and it would be Max, if he ran him out of racing room and maintained the position, would be receiving a 5-second time penalty, as George Russell did, as Oscar Piastri did. But he didn't. He stayed ahead at the apex, but because he carried too much speed, he not only ran Lando Norris out of room because Lando had nowhere to go, but he went 4 wheels well outside of the racing limits, the white line, track limits. So as per the rules, Max Verstappen should have been afforded a 5-second time penalty there. Now, Lando Norris has overtaken off track, which is gaining an advantage, and that's why he got a 5-second time penalty. However, while you cannot overtake off track, I believe personally there's mitigating circumstances. If you have been the only reason you're off track in the first place is because a driver is out of control of his car. And by definition of him being outside of track limits, Max, he is out of control of his car. Lando is entitled to use that runoff and come back side by side along Max, in my personal opinion, because if Max was in control of his car, Lando would have been afforded racing room, and Lando would have been ahead at the apex and been ahead going into the next corner. So I think there should be, you don't ever want to see anyone overtake off circuit, but I think there's mitigating circumstances when you are forced off track like that, when technically you're ahead while technically not ahead at the apex. You should be able to keep your foot in it and come back on track, as long as it's on track safely, and continue racing. That's my opinion. That, of course, wasn't what the stewards and what the rules currently kind of say, and that's why they afforded Lando a 5-second time penalty. However, we've just mentioned that really Max should have also received a 5-second time penalty, I believe, for forcing a driver off of the racing surface, because he was out of control of his car, as that guideline or racing rule states, and that would have nullified the racing or allowed them to continue racing. And where this really gets a big issue for me is that there was an identical situation that happened on lap 1 down into turn 12, where the roles are basically reversed, and Max kept his foot in it round the outside and regained the position on Sainz. No penalty given. Now, regardless it's lap 1, I don't think that should even be taken into consideration, because they're halfway round the lap now. They're already quite substantially ahead of the cars behind. This is fair. This is supposed to be fair racing now. This isn't lap 1, turn 1, and Sainz should have been straight on the radio. I don't know if he was from memory, saying he's just maintained that position. That's a penalty. It wasn't even looked at from my memory. Wasn't even looked at, and Max should have been either given a penalty there, and personally, as per the racing rules, he should have been for gaining an advantage, or later on in the race, as consistent application of the rules, which we know unfortunately there isn't consistent application of the rules, he should have been, Lando shouldn't have been given a 5-second time penalty. You know, like for like. This is the problem we see, is that there's not a consistent application of the rules. And we'll get onto the actual stewards themselves. It does seem like there's not a consistent application of the rules when it comes to Max Verstappen. Now, you can say Red Bull in general, but to be honest, Perez is never really in this kind of scenario or in this position to have these sort of rulings go for him or against him. The only time he's ever really had anything go against him is when he's been blatantly in the wrong and just shoved his car into the side of another and made contact. But it's always because of Max, because he's fighting for the lead and he's fighting up front with the Ferraris and the McLarens. So yeah, that's basically why Verstappen didn't get a penalty for pushing Lando off, and why George and Piastri did. Why he didn't get one for lap 1, maintaining the position, when Lando did, I don't know. They've acknowledged, the stewards, that Max did run off track as well, which is bizarre. And they've acknowledged that he ran off track and still ran Lando off track, but Lando's still in the wrong. I just don't... I don't know. You either don't give them a penalty and you leave it as it is because, look, it's hard racing and they're both at fault. Like, I know two wrongs don't make a right, but they're both at fault. There's mitigating circumstances there, but Lando's only wide because the driver on the inside is out of control. Like, yeah, it's just bizarre to me, absolutely bizarre, and it's not a consistent application of this horrible rule that I don't like. What is so wrong with just leaving racing room? If a driver is on the outside, he's just got his front wheels alongside the rear wheels, he's entitled to room, in my opinion. It works pretty similarly that way across all motorsport series across the world, and I don't see what is so wrong with that. It works for everyone else. Why does F1 have to be any different? It has to be different because they've accommodated Max's driving style, and that's basically why. But the problem is here is that they've not only accommodated Max's driving style here, but they've gone beyond that and allowed him to go off track himself, a la Brazil 2021, and given a penalty to the driver who actually hasn't really done anything wrong other than keep his foot in it and gain a position off track. But you have to look at why he was in that position in the first place. So yeah, absolutely bizarre, and I just don't like it. I just want us to just want fair will to will racing, and it just kind of isn't in that regard. But it's also not Max's fault to an extent because he's allowed to do it. So why would you not keep doing it? And staying with Max, our next question in regards to whether he drives aggressive or dirty. Project asks, where is the line between racing aggressive and racing dirty? And do I think Max is crossing it when racing closely with other drivers? So let's look at this race in isolation. Max was driving unbelievably well. Brilliant. It was a defensive masterclass. Now, removing the last incident, which we'll touch on again in a second, he was positioning his car perfectly. If you want to learn how to defend, and defending is an art, bearing in mind, racing isn't just all about overtaking, it's also about defending. Whether you're sim racing, karting, junior racing, whatever you're doing, defending well, you get such a buzz from it as you do from chasing someone down and making an overtake. And Max was positioning his car perfectly, and Lando, with that extra grip, just couldn't get round Max. Now, we'll touch on Lando's driving in particular in a second because there's a couple of questions on Lando, but Max was just making Lando go round the long way always. Max was just focusing on ensuring he hit his braking markers and that he had enough grip on the exits. But he didn't run too wide. He was going slow enough so that he wasn't allowing Lando to do the cutback through, say, turn 1 or through turn 12. He was ensuring that he was slowing his car down enough and hitting the apexes and getting a good exit, and just really ensuring that Lando had to use that extra grip that would be off the racing line, and Lando just didn't have it. He didn't have enough tyre delta, he didn't have enough grip and life in his tyres to make that advantage work. And yeah, it was absolutely brilliant driving from Max. Anyone could take a lesson from it. And that's the Max Verstappen we know can drive like this. He doesn't need the rules to be in this certain way to benefit him, because we know he's got the talent to drive like this fairly, aggressively, but fairly. Now, where Max does cross the line is where he jinks in the braking zone. That's pretty much most of the time where Max has been crossing the line, because he did it when he first kind of joined F1, famously against Kimi Räikkönen at the end of the Kemmel Straight, which was very, very dangerous. He did it in Austria as well, where the FIA even stated the week later that he should have been given a black and white flag for jinking in the braking zone. You're not allowed to make two defensive moves. But Max is very clever in the fact of that he will do this until he's told otherwise not to. And it's not his fault, but he's allowed to do this, basically. And that's the issue. That's where the issue lies. Like the whole racing rules, head at the apex scenario, we don't like it as fans, and I think most racing drivers don't like it, but it's been introduced because of the way Max drives, and he's been allowed to get away with it, and the rules have even been accommodated to his driving style. So why is he not going to keep doing it? So you can't blame Max on one hand, because he's only doing what he's allowed to do as per the rules, and why not? It's like if you were in football, if you're allowed to get away with two-footed tackles, yeah, they're dangerous, but people would do them because they're allowed to make them. Of course, they're not allowed to because the rules outlaw them. But as the rules currently are, Max is doing what he's allowed to get away with, and he cleverly does all this stuff until he's told otherwise not to. And more often than not, he isn't told that he can't do them. So we didn't see any jinking in the braking zone this time around, thankfully. And I don't think we have seen any jinking in the braking zone from Max since then, since Austria. And of course, we know the incident in itself. It's not dirty, what he did. It's just clever. It's just clever. He just lets the stewards decide, primarily. He knew Lando had the grip on him. He knew Lando ultimately had the quicker car at that phase. He was defending tremendously well, and there was going to become a time where Lando got a run on him, and that's where he did. And he just went, yeah, I'm just gonna basically run him out of room here regardless. I'm just going to ensure I'm ahead at the apex. Let the stewards decide. If it turns out that I'm penalised for it, okay, so be it. Like, Lando keeps the position, but if they don't, happy days. And that's exactly what happened yesterday. So very, very clever driving for Max, but that's really the only time he goes obviously above and beyond. He's been probably too aggressive and dirty in the past, most notably 2021. But yeah, if he's getting away with it, why is he going to keep doing it? Until someone reins him in, he's going to keep doing these moves down the inside that aren't particularly dirty. He's just allowed to get away with them. So, but the question is why is Max allowed to get away with them? And that brings us on to the stewarding in itself. We've already touched on it in the actual incident between Max and why some people got penalties and didn't, and why did Max not get a penalty, but exactly the same scenario on lap 1 compared to later on with Lando. And just quickly touching on lap 1 in itself with Max on Lando, where he sent it down the inside. I know people have been stating that why was that not investigated, myself included. I'm now convinced that he was just within track limits, like he had probably one wheel or his left wheels on the white line. I'm yet to see an onboard from Carlos Sainz, who was directly behind him, to see that, but it's very, very tight, and I'm going to assume Max actually was within track limits, and that's why he was able to keep that position on Lando. But should have Lando found himself in that position anyway, we'll get on to next with a couple of questions. But Andrew Petty, thanks Andrew, has asked, is it time for the FIA to cycle in new stewards with more recent experience of F1? He adds that Derek Warwick's, who we'll touch on in a minute, his last F1 race was 40 years ago, and his last race at all was nearly 30 years ago. So his experience, of course, is very largely removed from current F1. Is it time for ex-drivers like Button, Vettel, Rosberg, etc., others from their generation to take over stewarding duties? And then we have Kieran762 asks, what is my opinion in the correlation in stewarding decisions? Is it becoming clear that Red Bull get the run-of-the-mill with decisions? So firstly, with Andy's question about should we have more stewarding or stewards who are more recent in racing F1, I think we've got to that point. Yes, I think we should. I think I don't always necessarily think that you need to have raced, shall we say, or to not necessarily to have raced, but to have had real life F1 experience to know what good racing is and to know what is acceptable and what isn't, as per the regulations. I think a lot of people who have done sim racing or have watched F1 for a long time and are keen fans know what is acceptable and what isn't. What would help though most definitely, I think, with the stewarding now though is having a freshen up. It's quite evident that the stewards they've got on cycle at the moment is not, it's just not doing it. It's too inconsistent, isn't it? It's too inconsistent, and there is a case, touching on Kieran's mark, that there is a touch of biasness that happens, or there is a pattern that has occurred in regards to decisions falling a certain way when certain stewards are on the roster for the weekend. So Derek Warwick, as an example, he is a driver that famously has ties to Honda and to Red Bull. Now, look, there are going to be people working within the FIA and with F1 who have some sort of experience working or an affiliation with a team. That's how you get experience within F1, is that you've worked for a team previously. So human beings as well, as much as you try to be unbiased, there is always going to be some unconscious bias or a little bit of bias here and there. It's about trying to look at things as subjectively as you possibly can. But it does seem to be, and there does seem to be a pattern that has occurred, that whenever Derek Warwick has been on, has been a steward and has been ruling when Max Verstappen has been at the forefront of incidents, Max has come out very favourably. And that's kind of what Toto Wolff alluded to as well. 2021 was, I mean, he was one of the stewards in Abu Dhabi. He was, I think, in Brazil even as well. He props up. His name props up quite a bit when Max Verstappen is at the forefront of contentious decisions. And you do have to raise the question of, well, is that because of his connections, and is there some bias happening there in regards to in favour of Max Verstappen? Not particularly Red Bull, and in a sense, maybe it is Red Bull, but we never really see these contentious decisions with Sergio Perez, but that's because Perez never really finds himself in these positions, because he's always fighting his way through the field and is never really at the front battling out like this. Sorry, Perez fans, but that's kind of just fact. So yeah, I mean, you do have to raise that question, and I just think we should have we should have at least a minimum of maybe, I think we should just have a full-time set of stewards. Now, technically we've got that, but they're on rotation. I think we should just have 3 stewards that are there at every single race. Maybe 4, because if one of them's ill, as an example, he comes in as a reserve. But I think we should have a set of professional stewards, 4 of them, that are at every single race. One of them steps in as a stand-in as cover if need be. And at least 2 of them are former F1 drivers, as an example, within the last 15, 20 years, even 20 years, because we're now in 2024, but maybe the last 15 years, because you look at Jenson Button's analysis. Now, Anthony Davidson did a brilliant job, and he always does when he's analysing incidents and so forth, and he says it how he sees it, regardless of which driver and which team. And he analysed the whole Verstappen and Norris incident very well, but what he failed to pick up was what Jenson Button picked up, and he was the only pundit to do so. That, as mentioned previously, Max let off the brakes and he ran. The only reason he's ahead at the apex is because he's let off the brakes, he's carried too much speed for the corner, and he's out of control of his car ultimately because he's run off track. And Button said that's not right. That's a problem with the regulations, clearly, that is allowed. But the racing guidelines actually indicate he shouldn't have been allowed to do that, as we've mentioned, in regards to going off track. But someone like Button would be a good steward, or at least drivers, who have more recent experience of race. I think we've got to that point now where we need that. We need to freshen up. I get why they have the rotation of the stewards, because it's to try and ensure that there's no biasness, that there's ultimately no way that these drivers can have, these stewards can be bribed, as an example. Doesn't matter which sport you go to, there is always some form of corruption. People like to think that it doesn't exist, but unfortunately it does. I think we just got to that time now, and I don't know why we don't have that, because at least you would get consistent decisions, whether they're consistent, whether we agree necessarily, as earlier on Max is not given a penalty for Carlos Sainz. That's fine if that is then applied later on in the race in a similar scenario with Lando, but it wasn't. So that's what we want. We just want consistency regardless. So now let's get on to Lando, shall we? Lando. Who would have thought he would have lost 5 points over the duration of this weekend on Max Verstappen? That gap is now to 57 points. He needs an average of 11.6 points per race weekend now. 5 race weekends remaining, 2 sprint races included in there. It's a very, very tall order for him, isn't it? It's looking less likely, that's for sure. And you do have to say this weekend, a lot of it does have to lay, a lot of the blame lays at Lando, really. Now, the whole incident in itself, of course, we've discussed and we've mentioned it's been discovered in much detail across the internet. But ultimately, should Lando have even found himself in that position? He had a poor sprint race, qualified 4th and got it into P2. Obviously, at the start, he did what Charles Leclerc did, what Lando did ultimately. And they obviously got the setup wrong, McLaren. That's a team issue. Oscar Piastri also struggled with setup, and they found themselves suffering on their tyres. They fixed that over the after the sprint race for qualifying. He could have maybe not even found himself on pole position if it wasn't for the yellow flag brought out by George Russell. But anyway, he found himself on pole nonetheless. And Lando got an unbelievable start. He was, I think they showed that his reaction time was 0.27 and Max's was like 0.32. And he was clearly ahead of Max, like enough so much that he was he could have moved in front of Max Verstappen. And that brings us on to a question by Frida McGilligan. Do I think Lando needs to be more aggressive during races to win the championship? 100% yes, because going back to that race start, Lando got a great start. He moved over to cover Max, but he left the perfectly sized gap, or enough of a gap, shall we say, for a Red Bull of Max Verstappen to fit his car into. And I do think Lando's still got some naivety behind him. I don't think we can deny that. I think a lot of the time he thinks Max isn't going to go for a move, or maybe he's got the job done, but still leaves half a chance for Max to go for a move. And Max is always going to go for that chance, especially when he's got a 50-point plus lead. Like, I'm not saying Max would do it, but Max knows he can afford to have contact. He knows that there's less risk for him shoving his nose into an overtake and for contact to happen and lose his front wing than it is for Lando Norris, because Lando's the one where every single point matters. Max has already got that substantial lead over him, so he can afford to do this. And Max has always kind of had that attitude anyway of, I'll go for it. If you turn in, move in, then we'll crash. But he was always going to go for that move. Everyone knew that if there was room given, regardless of how tight and acute that angle was into turn 1, he was going to go for it. And he did. And Lando had the opportunity to completely shove his car right in front of Max. Now, if Max was in Lando's position, Max would not have left that door open. Hell no. No way in hell. He would have cut Lando's nose off and just moved straight in front of him and ensured that you ain't coming past regardless. This is my corner. I'm on the inside and I'm making sure my championship rival does not get ahead of me. Lando just wasn't aggressive enough, and it kind of just shows that he is learning what it is all about to race Max Verstappen. And Lando does have pace, but when it comes to those defining moments, he doesn't have the grit between his teeth. He's too nice. And I've said this before, earlier on in the season, at the halfway mark, Lando needs to be more of a dick. He needs to be more of a dick, and he's just not that sort of person. He needs to be on track, especially when he's racing Max. I think there's still maybe a bit of an element there of he's racing his friend, and he's thinking, oh no, like we'll still be able to go fair racing. I'm not going to completely shut him off, but roles are reversed. Max is doing that regardless if it's his friend or not. Like, he wants to win. He wants to win this championship, and that's what Lando is getting a very, very harsh lesson on this season, and this race highlighted that. Now, also to include, to add on to, could he have been more aggressive? Yes. There was a number of times, I think, in that battle where he could have gone for a move, a late send down the inside into a couple of the corners. And he didn't. He always chose the outside line, and we know Max is going to try and guard that inside line as much as possible. He needs to try and do a late switchback if he could. Try and do something aggressive. Now, what I liked about Lando in Austria is that he was aggressive. We saw that, but then we haven't really seen that since from him. And that's what Lando needed to do yesterday in that battle with Max, and he didn't. Maybe it was just being a bit too scared of there being contact again, having echoes of Austria playing in his mind when he was trying to go for move, when he was racing Max there and chasing him down. But yeah, he needs to be more aggressive. He just isn't. You look at every champion and of recent history, of the modern era, they've always been aggressive. Sebastian Vettel was aggressive and a bit of a dick. Fernando Alonso, we know Michael Schumacher most definitely was. Lewis Hamilton has been as well. Go look back at his battles with Nico Rosberg when he was at McLaren as well. Like, yeah, Lewis Hamilton is a fair driver, but he can be aggressive and be a dick on track when he wants to as well. And Lando has just failed to show that. No doubt he'll learn from it, but now as we currently stand, I don't think, unless something dramatic happens with the drop-off in performance with Red Bull again, but now it looks like they've actually picked up in their performance and at least got back to a decent-ish level compared to Ferrari and McLaren. I don't see McLaren, or I don't see Lando in particular, winning this championship now. I think Max is just going to be up there, and all Max needs to do is just beat Lando as well. That's the thing. He doesn't even need to win every race. He just needs to finish ahead of Lando, and championship is his. Interestingly though, could McLaren have done a bit more with their strategy? Because Manas Missile, hope I've pronounced that correctly, says he watched the stream. Thank you guys. Thank you for tuning in to the watch along. And from what he remembers, McLaren was so focused on Max that they lost an opportunity. If they would have pitted earlier, Lando could have finished ahead of Carlos and Oscar ahead of Max. What do I think? From memory serves me correctly, I don't think so. The thing is with McLaren is that Lando even stated after the race that the medium compound tyre, they did actually struggle with that in the kind of first phase of the race. Towards the end of the second stint, when they got through the graining, the pace came back to them, and they were actually very quick on the medium. They really were. And Carlos Sainz did the undercut quite early on Max Verstappen. Max extended for, I think, another 3-4 laps, and then McLaren went beyond that. I'm not sure. I think McLaren have always been if you look at their strategy throughout the duration of this year, they like the overcuts. They've always gone for that extra tyre delta and chase down. Track position here is not that big of an issue. It's not that key. Of course, we saw Lando fail to get past Max, but really track position at COTA isn't the be all and end all. Having a tyre delta is more important because you can do switchbacks. You can make use of that extra tyre wear that you have, or that tyre delta over your opponent to get by them. And there's multiple lines through corners to utilise that. Of course, Max was very, very good with his defence, as previously mentioned. I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe the undercut could have worked. Maybe they could have done it actually in hindsight and got ahead of Max Verstappen. But then maybe they thought that Red Bull Max on like-for-like tyres, maybe they thought that actually Max would get past them. I don't know. It would be interesting. I think they had faith in Lando getting past with that tyre delta. I don't think Oscar could have got ahead of Max Verstappen. Oscar was just way off the pace throughout. Maybe with McLaren they went a lap too long. There was a period where they were lapping the same as Max Verstappen on the set of hard compound tyres on the medium, and then there was a lap where they lost a second. When Max's tyres came in, there was a second that they lost on Max, and then they decided to pit. So maybe they just stayed out there a touch too long for that tyre delta. But I don't think strategy-wise McLaren let them down yesterday. I think it was more so just Lando. Lando should have led into turn 1, ultimately. He should have been ahead of Max Verstappen, but he wasn't. He was behind him. So that's really where the race was lost. I don't think there was too much of an opportunity when it came to strategy. So that's Lando, Max, McLaren, Red Bull over and done with. Let's talk about Ferrari, because what a performance. At the start of this video, I did state Ferrari have had their thunder pretty much stolen by the battle between Max and Lando. Of course, it's for the World Drivers' Championship, and it ended so contentiously. But Ferrari, what a performance. I predicted it. I said it'd be a Ferrari 1-2. I did think it'd be Sainz, because Sainz had a great sprint race. They had tremendous pace. They were really good on their tyre deck as well. And that shone through in the race in particular. And we have a couple of questions, of course, on Ferrari. And the first one is, well, there's a couple here, actually. Do I think Charles can win the championship, the Drivers' Championship? Well, mathematically, he still can. Mathematically, he still can. He is 22 points behind Lando Norris as it currently stands. And I think if my maths is correct, I could be wrong here, I think he needs, on average, out of the last 5 races, he needs to gain 17 points, I think it is, or just under 17 points on Max Verstappen in the last 5 race weekends. Now, of course, that's a massive tall order. That would be even more surprising than Lando Norris winning. But the fact of it, he's less than a race win behind Lando Norris now is mad. And it could be even closer. It's most definitely a season of what if for Charles Leclerc and Ferrari. After Monaco, he was, I think, 26. I think he was actually under a race win, maybe 23 points behind Max Verstappen after Monaco. And then he had the most ridiculously bad run after that, with not finishing. I think he finished outside of the points in the next 3 out of 5 races. It was just shocking from Charles Leclerc, and primarily down to Ferrari, not down to himself. Austria, the sprint race weekend, and the race itself was terrible for him. Silverstone, we know what happened when he got sent out on the hard compound tyre, when it was basically raining, full-on raining at Circuit Villeneuve. So he lost so many points there, and if he scored in those, let's say he finished in the top 5 of those 3 races that he failed to pretty much score a single point in, he would be so much closer in this championship to Max Verstappen, and we could be talking about Leclerc and Verstappen championship battle. And then you look at Singapore as well last time around, where he should have qualified on the front row. He should have been up there fighting with Lando, or fighting with Max at least. Lando obviously was tremendously quick in that race, but if it wasn't for Ferrari getting the tyre blankets wrong, and they just sent them out on bone cold dry tyres, which is why Sainz crashed and why Leclerc just couldn't get a decent lap in, qualified in 9th. He could have been on the podium there as well, and it's very much been more so mistakes from Ferrari than it has been, say, from Charles Leclerc this season. And it's a real shame. It's a real shame for them. While Ferrari have made definite improvements and the car looks to be in a great place right now, they've sorted out their issues that they had prior to Monza. That Monza package sorted out the porpoising. The car looks great. They have definitely made improvements. And they didn't even bring upgrades this weekend. And look how good of a performance that was from them. So, no, I mean, mathematically, he has a chance at the Drivers' Championship, but no, he doesn't. Max is just too good at the moment. The cars are too reliable. There's no way that Red Bull's going to break down. I hope I eat humble pie because it would make the championship interesting if there was a breakdown from Max. But yeah, no. But there is a high possibility that Charles could finish ahead of Lando. How mad would that be in a championship battle between Max and Lando? Charles finishes second. That'd be crazy, absolutely crazy, but also thoroughly deserved as well. And we'll get on to Mercedes, but what about Lewis Hamilton, eh? Lewis Hamilton must be sitting there. People halfway through the season were thinking, he's now regretting his decision going back to Ferrari after winning Silverstone and Spa. But now look at it. Look how F1 is just flipping on its head every weekend pretty much, because now Ferrari are looking in a good place for the rest of the season going into maybe next year, whereas Mercedes, not so much. But there are some questions on Mercedes that we will get to. So there's one last question on Ferrari. We just mentioned the performance. TC.C asked, now Ferrari has returned to race winning position. Once again, do I think they can maintain its dominance for the next few races? I think Mexico is going to be a tall order for them. They don't really ever go well at Mexico. The Ferrari engine doesn't really do that well in high altitude. Let's look back at Austria. Look at the issues that Charles Leclerc had. Mexico has always been a poor race for them as well. While the engine is much better, I'd be surprised, to be honest with you, that they will be fighting for the win in Mexico. I kind of expect that to be McLaren and Red Bull again, like it was in Austria. Because the Honda engine does very well at high altitude. It seems McLaren, the Mercedes engine does as well. Mercedes, maybe. They always generally go quite well at Mexico. I do suspect with Mercedes' woes at the moment that Ferrari would be ahead of them. I just think they're going to be down maybe on horsepower and efficiency in that power unit at the high altitude of Mexico. The rest of the races, though, 100% I think they're going to be up there. Yeah, definitely in this form. It depends on the development. It depends whether the other teams have got other upgrades to come their way. Sprint weekends are very, very different, aren't they? They're very different. Of course, the teams don't have as much practice to dial in their setups. They're using data from the race to improve them. Ferrari got it in a great window early on. McLaren didn't. Red Bull did, but then didn't. Mercedes, I don't know. They don't seem to really do well at sprint weekends. Mercedes, they need that extra time, don't they, to dial in their setup. Evidently, this weekend showed that. So I think they will be strong. I think they'll be competing for podiums and the wins in a few of the races. Of course, they won in. They did well in Vegas as well, didn't they? Abu Dhabi is always not too bad for them. But yeah, I think Mexico is going to be a tall order for them, but I hope I'm pleasantly wrong. So let's touch on Mercedes, shall we? Oh dear, what a poor weekend it is to be a Lewis Hamilton fan and a Mercedes fan, kinda, because it was such an up and down weekend for them, wasn't it? Such an up and down weekend. Lewis Hamilton looked like he was going to get pole position if it wasn't for the yellow flag in the sprint qualifying, and then we have, of course, George Russell losing control of the car through turn 19. That is just so uncharacteristic of any car through there. The fact it went round on George on entry. And then we saw the same exact thing happen to Lewis Hamilton through the exact same corner. It was like identical. Absolutely. You could overlap the footage and it's basically frame for frame the same, except that Lewis Hamilton ended up beached in the gravel and not in the barrier like George Russell. But just a woeful weekend for the Mercedes team. Of course, George Russell, starting from the pit lane, had a mega recovery, and finished actually where he qualified, which was P6, ahead of Sergio Perez, who qualified P10, by the way. How bad is that from Sergio Perez? But yes, Marianne asks, aren't teams allowed to start both cars from the pit lane? What do I think Mercedes is doing? So yes, there is a few theories about this, and I was absolutely baffled by this decision because Lewis Hamilton was running new spec parts here this weekend. George Russell wasn't. Now, Lewis Hamilton has come out and said the new spec parts just made the car worse. They brought a brand new upgrade package to this weekend. Lewis Hamilton had on his car, and George Russell's car was the one that performed better. Now, sprint quality was where those new parts worked well, and Lewis Hamilton was considerably up on that lap at that point where he had to lift, and that yellow flag came out, which ruined his potential pole position. But we know with Mercedes, they're such a peaky car at the moment. Like, they need such specific track and air conditions for their car to work well. Like, they've got such a small window of peak performance that if it's not there, like 1 or 2 degrees difference could completely just make that car dog. And that's what happened on the sprint race, because while the lap was very good in qualifying, while the car was very good in qualifying, when it came to the race the next day, where the track temperature I think was around 5 degrees hotter than it was in sprint quali, George Russell's tyres just fell off the cliff. Lewis Hamilton's performance just wasn't there as it was the day before, and they finished so far back after 19 laps in a sprint race to the top 4. So yeah, really, really poor weekend from Mercedes. Now, the pit lane start, yes, you can start both cars from the pit lane. There is no rule against that. However, Mercedes made the conscious decision to not make any setup changes to Lewis Hamilton's car. Now, why they didn't, I don't know. Maybe it's because they didn't have enough parts for Lewis Hamilton's car. Lewis said he would have liked to have reverted to the old spec and given George Russell the new spec parts, because there is a rule at sprint race weekends that if you have a crash, you're able to substitute those parts out, the parts that are damaged, put the new parts on, and start from where you've qualified. So George Russell could have started P6 yesterday, but he would have had to have had Lewis Hamilton's parts on there, which I don't think they wanted to do. So they completely broke part Ferme rules to ensure that George could start from the pit lane and they could make a load of setup changes, etc. But Lewis Hamilton, they didn't do that, which was a bit bizarre. It was against what Lewis Hamilton wanted. He wanted to start from the pit lane. He wanted those setup changes. I don't know if they had a spare power unit there, maybe for him to have a brand new one. I don't know. But they could have potentially done that, but they chose not to. But for Lewis Hamilton, it started very well. He made 5 positions up in the first couple of laps, but then the setup changes that Lewis wanted clearly reared their ugly head, because we saw that crash or that spin into loss of control into turn 19, and Toto Wolff stated it. Lewis Hamilton doesn't do that. That's a car issue. And yeah, really bizarre. Maybe it was the rear wing. Just clearly, for a car to go round like that on the rear, you're not running enough downforce. I mean, and there's a clear indication of this, that when the lap times were compared with Max Verstappen and George Russell on Sky TV, you could evidently see how much time George Russell gained on Max Verstappen down the straights, which means he's running less load, he's less draggy, and that, unfortunately, though, meant that they didn't have enough downforce, I think, through the last turn 19, which was weird, because actually they were quite quick through the first sector all weekend. But maybe that's the tire, maybe that's the mechanical grip that they had, and then come the end of the lap, the tires were starting to fall away, and yeah, that lack of downforce that they had on the car, combined with the tires starting to lose their performance on the penultimate corner of the lap, meant that, yeah, he just went round, and it was just so uncharacteristic of them. So yeah, George Russell kind of saved what was a very poor weekend for Mercedes. But yeah, you had George Russell up in P6 and Lewis Hamilton down in 19th. His worst ever qualifying at COTA, and his worst ever performance, finishing dead last. Just, yeah, absolutely shocking weekend from them. Moving on to a team that's a little bit further down the grid, but not too far, in the form of Haas, as Machine_Chaz asked, do I think Haas scoring points will give them momentum for the next 5 races? 100% yes. I have to make an open apology to Haas. I thought they were going to be down at the bottom, not as bad as Stake F1, but I thought they'd be down there struggling to score points regularly. Oh, how wrong have I been? How wrong have I been? Because, I mean, yes, Gunther Steiner probably has to take a bit of credit, because it's still technically his car, because he left at the start of this season, and this car would have been started to be developed last year. But the new team principal that has come in, if it has obviously was promoted, apologies. I know that he was head engineer, and his name passes me by. I do apologise, but Haas, what he's done, what he's implemented clearly, and the car that they've provided, combined with Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen, removing his issues and the penalty points that he's gathered this year and the crashes and so forth. They've done brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. And for them to score double points in the sprint race, when bearing in mind only the top 8 score points, so not even the top 10, for them to score double points there, and then for Nico Hülkenberg to score points yesterday, and if it wasn't for an unexpected pit stop that Magnussen was required to make, I think most likely they had a puncture or a slow puncture that they picked up on their data, because it was the engine sounded very stressful over the radio for Magnussen to box, which actually put him out of P8 or 7 at the time. He was definitely a position ahead of Hülkenberg, down to P12, I think, and he finished P11, which is a real shame for Magnussen. They could have scored double points again. So what a home race it was for Haas. What a year it's been for them. And yeah, I fully expect them to be flirting with the points for the remainder of fighting for the points for the remainder of the season, because if you look at it, you would normally suspect that those last 2 points positions should be taken by Aston Martin the majority of times. But Aston Martin are shocking right now. I mean, they are just a shadow of their former selves. Fernando Alonso having an absolute shocker of a weekend. I mean, so much so that he decided to pick a fight with Liam Lawson and have a go at him, which was just absolutely ridiculous. It gave me very much "they raced me too hard" vibes, a la Alex Albon back at the Nürburgring. But yeah, they are so far off the pace at the moment, Aston Martin, even though Alonso did brilliantly in qualifying, but he just fell through the field, and they don't even look like scoring points. And I mean, Colapinto's doing a great job at the moment. He's putting Alex Albon to shame now. This race is not a true reflection on Alex Albon's performance, because he got wedged and at the first corner with Lewis Hamilton sending it down the inside. Very aggressive move from Lewis Hamilton, and Albon basically got wedged in between Esteban Ocon and Lewis Hamilton, and that's what spun Ocon round at turn 1, and he had to make an early pit stop for a front wing, which compromised his race. But yeah, Williams really, RB every now and then, I think, are going to be fighting for some points. We know that they're quite good at Mexico. But yeah, they look to consistently be up there, and we know Nico Hülkenberg is brilliant with qualifying. He always pulls it out the bag. So yeah, I was wrong. Happy to hold my hands up and say I was wrong. And what a performance this year. And hopefully they can continue this, because normally Haas fall off in the second half of the year. Their development path, they start off strong, and their development isn't as good as the other teams, and they get overtaken. But they've done very well this year in regards to their development. That is something that I think has to be taken, has to be given credit to the new team principal. That isn't Gunther Steiner's doing. And yeah, fair play to them, fair play. And I'm looking forward to seeing how they finish the season, and I'm looking forward to that partnership next year of Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman. And lastly, guys, we have a question from Corpil2500, who asks me, what specific moments or events from the 2024 US Grand Prix stood out to me as the ultimate highlights or surprise? For me, I think it's 2. It's Liam Lawson and Franco Colapinto. Colapinto is just such a breath of fresh air, isn't he? He's just such a likeable guy. He is doing unbelievably well in that Williams, and just continuing to show James Vowles and Williams that they should have made this decision at the start of the season. Who knows where Williams and Colapinto could be right now, potentially with that seat secured for next year and not Carlos Sainz, and with more points on the board than they currently have. He's doing absolutely brilliantly. No one kind of expected it of him, and it's just, yeah, it's great to see someone who is just enjoying what they're doing. It's so enjoyment and happiness is so infectious, and when you see someone who's so passionate about what they're doing, just have a big smile on their face in every interview. Of course, it helps when it's going well for you. Of course, it is. But he's just enjoying every single minute of it. He's still got 5 more race weekends, of course, the 2 sprint races included, to the end of the season. I don't think he's going to have a seat for next year, unfortunately, because Sauber, I think Sauber will probably keep Valtteri Bottas on for another year, or they might bring in a junior driver. I don't see why you'd go outside your own junior academy to basically help train up another team's junior driver. But maybe I'm wrong. I think Colapinto will be reserve driver next year, but he's definitely going to give James Fowles a bigger headache every race weekend, and it's so great to see. And Liam Lawson, welcome back. Welcome back, because he was shafted this weekend, really, and I think in the long run, it seemed to help him. But he was given a 60-place grid penalty at the start of the weekend with his first race back in a year, with a 60-place grid penalty for a brand new power unit change and some other parts as well around that. And you're thinking, oh God, he's starting from the back of the grid in an RB car. He's going to struggle here this weekend. And wow, how wrong was I? Because he just, with that new power unit, that RB was in his hands, was really pacey. A great strategy from RB for once as well. Typical Daniel Ricciardo must be sitting at home thinking, where was that strategy for me? Because they kept him out there on the hard compound tyre long. He ended up on the medium compound at the end, and he finished P9. What a great result from him after starting P19. 10 positions gained, and a lot of that was done out on track as well with overtakes. And the sweetest moment for me was him just overtaking Fernando Alonso so cleanly in the race after fighting him hard but fairly in the sprint race the day before, and Fernando Alonso getting his pants in a twist was just, beautiful to see. And what a great performance. And I'm just loving the young guns, or the youngsters, coming through and just showing that faith needs to be given to the new generation. It's about time, and we're starting to see it next year. Obviously, we've got quite a few new drivers on the grid, and it's going to be great to see, because they are going to provide us with some great racing, and they're great characters as well, rather than the old guards who are starting to get past it and not really providing much value to the grid anymore. So those are my 2 specific moments of the weekend, and I think Ferrari as well, because Ferrari were just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I will end on kind of not a negative note, but I will end on the Alpine livery. What was you thinking? I'm surprised that McLaren didn't pursue copyright infringement for the Alpine livery, because there were plenty of times when I was watching the TV coverage or glancing at the TV coverage, and I thought it was the McLaren, and actually it was the Alpine, because what was they thinking going to basically papaya? I'm sure it's a different shade of orange or papaya, and they would say, oh no, actually it's this, and it's got a particular name behind it, like there's 25 different shades of white. But what were they thinking? Absolutely horrible livery. They've messed up their liveries this year after the first announcement of their livery, of course, or non-livery, shall we say. But I just wanted to make mention of that at the end. But overall, a brilliant weekend of racing. Circuit Americas continues to provide. Can't wait to be back here next year. And of course, we now head to Mexico, where unfortunately it's always a bit of a damp squib. It's always pretty boring. Hopefully it isn't, but we'll see. At least we got a safety car for the first time in 10 races, guys. Woo! Hopefully we see that hopefully we get a couple of safety cars in Mexico. That's kind of the only way that we get any good racing there. So but we'll see you for the watch alongs this weekend. Hope you guys enjoyed that. As always, get your questions in for next weekend, and looking forward to it. Can Lando actually get a race win and cut dramatically into Max's championship battle, or will Max Verstappen completely end that challenge in this next Grand Prix? We'll see. We'll see you guys then. Bye.